Today we're going to study Daf Yud Aleph, and we're looking on the second line from the top. This is a very, very famous blot Gemara, both Amud Aleph and Amud Beis. Minoha milsa di Omer Rabbanan zil basa ruba. We find that in many different halachas, including in Shechita, we rely on rov. What's the source in the Torah that we can rely on rov? Maybe the Torah would say, let's be choshesh for the miut. Let's worry about the minority. Who says the majority rules? And even though the Gemara has already established a source for chazaka, but that's because you have a definite status quo, but not in the case of rov. Minolan, says the Gemara, dichsiv achrei rabim lahatos. So the Torah says the following, that let's say there's a court case, and the courts are divided up into Bezdin HaGadol, and then there's a Sanhedrin Ketana, and a regular Bezdin of three. We take a vote, and the majority of judges will determine the halacha. That's called, in the language of Shas, Ruba de Isa Kaman, which means a rov that we can point to. It's not some sort of a physiological or psychological assumption on our part, but rather we count the number of judges and we calculate the majority. And the law is determined by the majority. That's called Achrei Rabim Lahatos, or Ruba de Isa Kamon. So the Gemara goes on and says the following. Ruba de Isa Kamon, I can give you a case in halacha where we have a suffix and we can count the majority. For example, Kigon Tesha Chanuyos, the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin we already discussed, counting the votes. And Tesha Chanuyos means if you find a piece of meat and you don't know where it came from, whether it came from the kosher butcher shop or the non-kosher butcher shop, then you determine that since there are 9 against 1, or for that matter, 6 against 4, then you assume it came from the rov. Lo kami boila. That I understood up front, and that was never a question. That's achrei rabim lahatos, it's explicit. Ki kami boila, our suffix was ruba de lesa kamon. When you have some sort of rov that's based on nature, on psychology, on physiology, but you can't count the numbers in front of you. Kigon, katan uktana. Let's say a man dies without children, leaves a wife, and she falls for yibum. The only problem is that the yavam is a katan. He's less than bar mitzvah. So he's not capable of being mekayim the mitzvah of yibum. And there's even a possibility that the yavama herself is a ketana, which means that she was married off before the age of 12 by her father, and the Torah recognizes that marriage as a full-fledged marriage. But she's not capable of yibum. And the Gemara wants to know, can we allow them to have yibum even without the official kiyum mitzvah? But the problem is that whether or not there is a nefila for yibum depends upon something that's going to be clarified only later on. Why? Because there's something called an islandess or a saris. These are either males or females who are incapable of procreation. And in such a case, there's no nefila for yibum. Now, you might say, well, what do we lose by it? Let them live together as husband and wife. But the answer is, if there's no mitzvah of yibum, for example, let's say it turns out that she's an islandess, and therefore she didn't fall for Yibum, or he's a Saris, and we'll only find that out later down the line, then it turns out that he's having a relationship with Eishes Achiv, with the wife of his brother, which is an erva. The only thing that removes and permits erva in the case of Eishes Ach is the mitzvah of Yibum, but we don't know there's a mitzvah of Yibum. So the answer is, if the Torah allows Yibum in such a case, it must be because the Torah is relying on a rov, a ruba de lesa kaman, that most individuals will not be, pardon the double negative, incapable of having children, but rather most will be capable of having children. Now, Minol in the Gemara says, it would be very nice if we had a pasuk that said that even if he's a katan and she's a ketana, that we will allow Yibum and will allow them to live together, but we don't have such a pasuk. So you're right, you came up with a scenario in which, in order to be matir, we have to rely on a ruba de lesa kamon, but how do you know that the Torah recognizes the validity, the viability of a ruba de lesa kamon? Amar Rabbi Lazar, Asya miresha shel ola. So now we're talking about a korban ola. And the Torah Diyama Krav and Nitach Osol Sacheha, right? The Kohen is called upon to cut the Ola into pieces, and that's called the Nitach. And the Torah says Linsacheha means into pieces. However, these pieces are large pieces, velo nisacheha linisachim. But we don't cut up the head of the Ola into smaller pieces before we makriv it. And now the question is, Balecho Shema Nikev Krum Shalmach. Maybe this animal is in fact a treifa, because perhaps the membrane that surrounds the brain is punctured. Now, you cannot bring a korban on the Mizbeach if it's a treifa. Elalav, we have no choice but to assume that if the korban ola exists, even after nituach, meaning even after he would fulfill the mitzvah of nitach osol and sachera, but there's no way he could check whether or not there was a nekev b'krum shel moach, because that would require that he take apart the head into very, very small pieces, and that we're not allowed to do. Elalav mishum damrinon zil basaruba. We must be relying on the natural rove that in nature most animals do not have a nekev b'krum shel moach. They're healthy animals. Although there are animals that fit the minority, but the Torah is relying on the majority. Gemara says, Mimai, I'm going to reject Rebbe Lazar. Why? Dilma de palile ubadakle. The Gemara thinks that maybe there's a possibility that the Kohen is able and required to split the head open of the animal and examine the krum shel moach to make sure it's intact. Ve'i mishum, and if you'll ask me, maybe you'll tell me that in order to really check out and finally make a determination that the krum shel moach is intact, he's going to have to break it into small pieces, and that he's not allowed to do. The Gemara says, you're right. If he would take a knife and slice it through from top to bottom, cut it completely into two, that the Torah doesn't allow. But if, let's say, he cuts parts of the brain, but it remains still attached, then leslan ba. That's not a violation. And therefore, maybe the Torah is requiring, in the case of a korban ola, that the Kohen actually checks out the head of the animal to make sure that there's no treifa and there's no nekev b'makom akrum. So therefore, having rejected Rabbi Lazar, the Gemara has to come up with a substitute explanation And answer to the question, from whence do we know that the Torah relies on Rov? Is Mar Breid Ravina Amar Asya Mishviras Etzem Bepesach. Right? The Torah says that in a carbon Pesach, you're not allowed to break the bone, and that's a violation of a lav. The Omer Rachmana v'yetzem lo sishbu bo v'nechu shema nikev krum shalmoach. Once again, in the case of Korban Pesach, we're enjoined from breaking parts of the head because the skull is considered an etzem, and the Torah says etzem lo sishru. You're not allowed to break the bones of a Korban Pesach, and yet a Korban Pesach, like any other korban, is only kosher if it's a healthy animal and it's not a nevela. But maybe we should be choshesh that the membrane that surrounds the brain is broken. Elalav mishum damrinan zil basar ruba. Mimai. So now the Gemara is going to reject Marbar Avina. Dilma demanach gumarta ale v'kolile ubadakle. The Torah only prohibits you from breaking the bone of the Korban Pesach, but you can theoretically achieve the same results without breaking the bone. You could take a coal, a hot coal, and place it on the skull of the lamb, and it burns through. And now he could take a look at the membrane, inspect it, and guarantee that it's not punctured. Tisanya, we have a brisa that will support our opinion that burning the etzem is not a violation. Hamachate begidin, if he cuts up sinews, because sinews are not bones. V'asoref batzamos, or even in bones, but instead of breaking the bone, he put a hot coal and burnt the bone. Ein bo mishum shviras etzem. So once again, we're out in the cold. We have not yet succeeded in discovering a source in the Torah for ruba de lesa kamon. Rav Nachbar Yitzchak comes up with another possibility. Asya me alya. The alya is the tail of the lamb. The Omer Achmana, the Torah says, Chelbo ha'alya tmima. So the tail, which is part of that which is niktar agam mizbech, has to be complete. The word tmima means it's got to be whole. V'leichus shema nifsucha chutz hasidra. The Gemara understands that the alya, the tail, is right above the, what's it called, the spinal cord, which is called the chut hasidra. Now, one of the various trephos that establishes the animal was injured in such a way that it cannot survive is an injury to the spinal cord. Now, the Torah says that the aliyah has to be shlema. If he wants to check that part of the spinal cord that's underneath the aliyah, he's going to have to cut through the aliyah, which he can't do. So obviously the Torah is relying on the fact that most animals do not have broken, punctured spinal columns. They're healthy, and therefore you can be makriv the carbon. And how is that so? We rely on Rov. Maybe you'll try to reject Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak by saying Demitase pasuk. Maybe perhaps there's a way of checking out the spinal cord without upsetting the status of the aliyah as tmima. And how would you accomplish that? You disconnect the tail below the end of the spinal cord. So you simply disconnect it. You have not in any way punctured it. It's still whole. But once it's disconnected from the spinal cord, then he's able to check the spinal cord to make sure that there's no puncture. So we're not going to rely on Rov. The Gemara says that could be a logical slug up, an argument, but it's not so. Because li umas ha'etza, Omar Rachmana, the Torah says opposite a certain bone, makom shaklayos yoatzos, which we're Chazal always see in the kidneys they give keilu etza, counsel, to separate the bad from the good. They take out the impurities. In any event, this is referring to the place where the kidneys are, and at that point, the tail includes in it a section, a part of the spinal cord, and therefore there's no way of checking out that part of the spinal cord that is li'umas ha'etza. So the Gemara says mimai. So now the Gemara is saying, well, Rav Nachman is relying on the majority in a ruba de lesa kamon that the spinal cord was not punctured. Dilma de pasachla ubadakla. Maybe enochinami, the Kohen is allowed to cut the tail in order to inspect the spinal column, which is being hidden by the tail. Now it's exposed. But the imishum tmima, your argument was that the Torah requires that the tail is whole. How can you therefore check out the spinal column by cutting through the tail? As we said before, there's a way of cutting it without severing it, without separating the two parts. And that would not be in violation of tmima. And in such a case, he exposes the spinal column and he's able to check out and be absolutely certain that there was no puncture that would make it into a treifa. If he still, after he cuts the aliyah, they're still attached at some point, they're not totally detached, then he doesn't violate the din of tmima with regard to the aliyah. And at the same time, it will expose the spinal column that was behind the tail, and we can now check and be absolutely certain that it's not a treifa. So therefore, we have to come on to another explanation. Rav Sheshes Bereder of Idiyomar, Asya mi egla rufa. Ruva de lesa come on is implicit in egla rufa. We're going to see that the egla rufa, which is brought down to the Nachal Eisan, if you find a slaughtered, a killed, the body, a corpse of a killed man between two cities, and in such a case, the egla rufa has a quasi din of kachim, even though again it's not brought on the mizbeach. You only do an arifa, but nevertheless it has to be a healthy egel and not a treifa. We're You know what? We're not going to break the bones of the calf of the egel in order to find out if there's any defect in the animal that would make it into a treifa. And if you'll tell me, who cares? The egla roof is not being brought on the mizbech. Who cares whether it's a treifa or not a treifa? Ha amri de beirav yarek haparak sivbek kikolchiv. In the parsha of egla rufa, the Torah in Dvarim Perek Aleph says that it's lekapara, and anything that's a kapara should be equated to a carbon, which is lekapara, and therefore, just like a carbon is only fit for the mizbeach if it's whole, but if it's a treifa, can't bring it on the mizbeach. The same halach applies to the arifas ha'egla. So, in any event, we seem to have finally arrived at a conclusion that we can derive as lina basaruba de lesa kaman from the case of egla rufa. That seems to be a convincing argument. So we have one source for the halacha of ro. Rabba bar Shilama, an alternate source for rov, asya mi paraduma. And we're going to soon see that paraduma cannot be a treifa. The Omer Achmon of Shachat v'saraf mashchita kishehi shlema af sreifasa kishehi shlema v'leichus dilma treifa havi. Ela mishum dabrin and zil basaruba. Right? In the case of paradum, you have to have a shchita, and then you have to have a sreifa. You have to burn the para. And therefore, we're going to make an equation between sreifa and shchita, just like shchita has to be b'shleima without any mum, any defect, and not a treifa. So too, the burning of the body of the paradum after shchita has to be to a body that's complete, meaning that it's not a treifa. V'leichas duma treifa, we have to worry about some sort of internal fatal defect. And the Gemara says, right, the Torah classifies and describes the paraduma as a chatos to teach me that it has to be shlema and not a treifa. So we have now two sources that could serve to teach us Azlina Bas Ruba the Lesser Kamon. We now have the case of Egla Rufa plus the case of Paradum. Now we have a third possibility. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Omar Asya Misora Mishtalech Rachman Omar Lokach Shnei Aseirim Shu Shneim Shavim. The Torah says that we do what's called a hagrola. We have two seirim, two he-goats that are identical, and the Avodas Kohen Gadol requires him to do hagrola and decide which of the two seirim al Hashem, that's called the Sarah Pnimi, and which al Azazel, which is called the Sarah Hachitzoni. And the Sarah Hachitzoni is equated with the Sarah Pnimi. And just like the Sa'ira Pnimi is brought on the Mizbeach, it cannot be a treifa, so too the Sarah Mishtaleach cannot be a treifa. And now we're going to have to worry again that maybe the Sarah Mishtaleach is a treifa.